We do the
recording in progress.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If there's a little, all right, Kimberly, if you interrupt this one, that's good. Never leave it out. Okay. Information on that password. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. I think we'll officially start the meeting. Walter's going to join us in about 15 minutes, and Ira, TJ, and Lois are out. I think that makes 9, right? Did I do my math right? I feel like when I was teaching kindergarten, like you're always counting heads, do I have all my ducks? Okay, so excellent. Well, it's good to see you guys. It's my first in-person meeting in 2.5 years. I saw many of you lovely people here last month. Thanks for the great discussion you had. I guess I should just wax on, right? Nick, we should get started on the approval of the agenda. Does anyone have the land acknowledgement in front of them or want to read it?
We'd like to acknowledge that we are on traditional land, rich and diverse group of peoples who have called this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the sense of these sources of today. Doing this, we aim to illuminate the longer history of this land we call home, our relationship to this history and the heritage of those peoples whose ancestors lived here before the European American migration.
Melissa, are you able to hear us okay? Okay, we'll speak up a little bit.
She's on mute. You're good, Jim.
Yeah,
Sorry.
if we talk at this volume, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know where the speaker's located at, where your microphone is located. I can hear you fine. I just can't hear anybody else.
Okay, we'll all. Yeah, I'll speak louder. Okay, so can I get a motion to bring our agenda to the table?
Second.
Excellent. Any discussion on the agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the agenda as published, please say aye.
Aye.
Vote. Okay, agenda passes. And welcome. Thank you. I was so excited to hear that you wanted to talk with us and that it happened so quickly. I feel like some of these things could drag on for months.
Well, I'm hoping this isn't my first and only visit. We'd like to sort of figure out how we can collaborate. So thank you. And so thank you for bringing this agenda. My name's Sarah Phillips, and I live in Lake Forest Park. The mayor and the council formed a climate action committee and identified people to be on it and confirm this and do all that sort of stuff. And we've had 3 meetings, so we're really, old timers. The first meeting was hello, how are you? So and we talked about what the issues that were important to us, and really the fundamental issue that was sort of undergirding this group was that we wanted to move on the issue of climate. There was a certain urgency to it, and that we wanted to talk to as many people as often as possible about this issue in the community. The second meeting, we did more brainstorming, trying to figure out sort of where we were. And then we decided that what the best thing, our first assignment was to create a work plan. And so we looked at what other cities had done, and it was pretty standard. And so we just stole theirs and proceeded, brought it to the council, and they approved it. And then it turned out, I think this is a funny story. Turns out there was a climate action plan that the city approved in 2008, and we were unaware of it. And I believe the city was unaware of it. It certainly wasn't in the forefront, and nobody mentioned it to us. So I asked Steve actually to see if he could help me find it. I heard about it, and then Steve found it. First he told me there wasn't one, and then he sent me a note saying, "Do you think this is it?" So it's actually a fabulous thing, because it's going to we're going to spend this next meeting, which as you may know is tomorrow, looking at this and seeing if it leapfrogs us over some things. It has some good emission studies, and so we're really looking forward to that. county is providing us soon with emissions for Lake Forest Park. They've done a study which they are quite pleased with, but it's not yet ready to launch, which will allow each geographic area to identify the emissions that are problematic for the greenhouse gases. So we're looking forward to that, and we'll incorporate that into the study. So I wanted to just be sort of aggressive and say, even before we know anything, we know some things. And some of those things are things we think you should do. And we'll figure out how to collaborate on. The first is that you probably know the state, there was this piece of state legislation, it was called Senate Bill 1099, which was to encourage, to require that all comp plan revisions include an element of climate. That did not pass. At the very end, it was, it was on this plan to pass, and then there was some snafu of some sort, and it didn't pass. Our new legislator from Bothell was the lead on that, Representative Jewett. So what a number of cities have done is decided they'll adopt that as well. The county is encouraging that in various places around the state. So I was hoping that as you thought about the comp plan, which you must be doing fairly soon, that you would consider adding an element on climate, to figure out if that's a piece, and then how we can work on it. The second thing I'd like you to kind of think about is one of the things we know is we have to make a transition to non-fossil fuels. So that means building code issues, which are very careful of you, building code recommendation people. So Shoreline, as you know, has created an ordinance and passed it, which says that I'm not sure of all the details, but commercial buildings over 4 feet have to use electricity and can't use gas, natural gas. Natural gas is a transition gas. Really, it's not good, but we shouldn't be putting gas lines in there, but that would be one. And the other is sort of what they call burnout ordinances. So if you have a gas water heater and it's done its useful life, the requirement would be to replace it with non-fossil fuel. It could be solar, it could be electric, but those are just, and we're not asking you to do it, we're asking you to think about it. And the third thing we have to think about is the transition to electric vehicles and electric equipment. Things like EV readiness, the infrastructure that's required, both for the city and for homeowners. How do we and to make sure that the city doesn't buy any gas powered vehicles. I think that my guess is the pushback will come from the police department, but police departments around the country are using vehicles now. And one of the ways to reduce our emissions, we know before we get the study, is to get super users to reduce their gasoline emissions. And I don't know this for a fact, but I would guess that our patrol cars are super users. They're driving around all the time. So if we could get that, would have a big impact on our emissions. And then the other side of that, of preparing for electric vehicles and equipment, is walkways and bike paths. I bike a lot. I rode my bicycle here, but there are many times when I feel like biking in the forest park is a context. It's very hard, and I'm lit up like a Christmas tree. I got reflectors on, my helmet lights up, got lights on everywhere, and people say, "Oh, I didn't see you." What else could I do? But I'm very concerned about that's just personal, though. But it's complementary. That if we can get people out of their cars easily and access. So for us, the next steps is we'd really like to come back and report as we go along. We'd like to figure out how we can collaborate, how it is that we, as you're moving on these issues, where there overlap, we can work together. And I just want to thank you for how do we come and raise these issues?
Questions, yeah.
I have the password.
Okay. Does anybody have questions of Sarah? Oh, it's one of those easy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is this, can anyone use this or?
Yeah, just Wi-Fi.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's capital A, RUBA, 2, capital L, capital F, capital P, and then asterisk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Could I just say Sarah made a presentation to council. I think it went very well. And one of the primary concerns of council was how do, for the city sponsored things, how do we pay for them? And we're about to start the budget process for 2023 and 2024. So it's a good time to be thinking about these things. We also did touch on the fact that perhaps our legislative agenda for the next legislative session should include funding for small cities like ours that don't have vast resources to do things like acquire electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations, because really there was no funding put forward for, despite the priority on climate action and greenhouse gas emissions, there was no funding for jurisdictions that to engage unless they have resources like Kirkland or Redmond and so forth. So I do think that will probably be on our priority list, and also the Association of Washington Cities, which we're part of the coalition on. So just it's really a follow-up and a context aspect to what Sarah presented. But basically, I think the council was excited, and I think the challenge will be, how do we prioritize? What can we do over time with the planning commission's involvement, where there are land use and zoning or building code implications? And then how do we muster resources? So Sarah was specifically asked to address what resources there are for some of these actions that might be proposed. So I think we'll all be searching for those. So that's a partnership. Kind of.
Will that be part of your scope of work to identify funding?
Yeah, there is. It's pretty easy so far.
I guess I mean that it's an advisory group in that it's not a policy setting, so you'll make recommendations to ultimately the council, including, and I wondered, would it also include perhaps knowledge of perhaps grants or funding?
Yes, I was a little flippant there. The answer is that there are 1 or 2 grants that are very specific, but not planning process grants, which I was most interested in. But there are very few resources available at this point. And it needs, I think Councilman Wood is exactly right. We want to pressure our state legislators to make that funding available. There are some commerce grants, the same way you guys got a commerce, maybe some commerce, you get a grant from the state to do planning for the comp plan, right? There's funding for it's Department of Commerce. Anyway, but I just met with somebody who was applying for their planning commission from the State Department, and I'm sure Steve has that information. But there are very few at this point about climate issues. Although, I think as we experience climate issues, there becomes a certain amount of urgency in people's where people are funding.
Sarah, you had asked, one of your asks was, can you return and provide status? I appreciate hearing that. So I thank you for taking the time. And climate specifically is not something that I would say I am just super knowledgeable about. And part of this position, I think for me, is to get a better understanding and share with other people in our position. So I personally appreciate it.
shepherding this. I know this has been a vision for a group of residents for a long time to do this. So that's a huge accomplishment that it's up and running. We've had 3 meetings, and I know it's a huge time commitment, and emotional commitment to do it. So thank you, first of all, for doing that. Second, could you maybe share with all of us so that we have a shared understanding of your structure, how many people who are on this committee, particularly the youth that you brought in? I'd love to hear a little bit about that overall. Okay, sure.
There are currently 10 of us. There's one vacancy, and the mayor is interviewing. My understanding is the mayor's interviewing for another candidate. And it's a fabulous group of people. We have 2 students are, I call them, they're our rock stars. They were both, I worked on the town hall on climate, and both of them were panelists. One is from Shortgrass. She's the ASB president this year. This is a young woman with a plate full of things, but she's passionate about climate. And she's worked, she's the kind of kid who wants to organize the staff of the high school, not the staff, but the custodians, so that they will make sure they do compost, because right now it was not quite, so she was working with the labor unions to move that. The other young woman is at Blanchette, I think. And she is also works with issues around healthcare and the intersection between healthcare and climate. And she's also works.
Is she also high school?
She's also high school. So the ASB president is a senior this year. So the other young woman is a junior. So and they have just been a real asset. The young woman from Blanchette is in charge of communications. She volunteered, and so say, okay. So she wants to know why the city doesn't have something. I don't know what, TikTok. She wants her own Twitter line. I don't know. So we're working through all those things, which is absolutely fabulous, because they're the people who are going to move this issue. We also have 3 professors, 3 UW professors, and that's been an extraordinary asset, because they read carefully and are big thinkers, and they have some resources that they can bring to us. And then there are 2 retired people, and how many is that? 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 3 other people. Drawing a blank. It's here, but there are. Oh, I know. There are 2 consultants, 2 people who are professional consultants in Lake Forest Park. One in geotech, and the other in shoreline protection. So it's an extraordinary group of people who are well poised to.
Get in if we let him in, Cameron. Yeah. Yeah, he should be.
Thank you.
So it's an extraordinary group and a pleasure. I'm always struck what a rich and deep reserve of talented people who live here. But it's a great opportunity.
Well, I echo Ashley's comments, and that we'll look forward to hearing more and learning more from the group, and certainly helping in any way possible with your efforts to gather information or put together, community sort of information sessions.
Well, we understand you did a great job with outreach on a survey, and the committee is looking at the surveys that were done in Rockville and Shoreline and Kenmore, and they want to put together something. They're not sure that's the first thing they want to do, but there are a series of things that they want to do. And the council is really suggested checking with you about that. It's such a nice job. We got that job.
Absolutely. And then also, anytime you want, feel free to reach out. In my professional life, I work on climate-related issues and connected with some folks across the country who are experts in climate communication and youth climate action programs. So terrific. Yeah. you're ever interested in any of that, I'm glad to sit down for coffee. Okay. Figure out how to help. Hey, Walter, welcome. Okay, well, is there any other questions or comments for Sarah before we move on? Melissa, do you have any questions or comments? Okay, all right, well, thank you so much for your time.
I think it was, it just. It was recorded, that's a good idea. That's a good
Yeah,
sign.
that's a good story. Okay, all right, well, moving along for our agenda, let me pull this.
Like to.
We are to the approval of meeting minutes. Did everyone have a chance to read those? That was,
Did we get those in our email? I couldn't find them. I'm sorry if I was looking in the wrong.
Nick put everything in the same PDF. If you scroll past the agenda, they're right after the agenda.
Which I really appreciate, by the way. I like you just go to one doc.
I think they start on the 4th page. No
Yeah.
problem. You can take a minute to scan while we ask if anyone has any. Oh, wait, we need a motion first. To bring the minutes to the table.
I motion to bring the minutes to the table.
Great, excellent, super. Does anybody have any comment about the minutes, any corrections, any questions?
I have a correction.
I think I know what it is.
Yeah, I was previously absent from the last meeting and I was shown as attendance in the minute, shown as in attendance in the minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Walter. You stole my one valuable contribution for the evening. Any other corrections or comments about the minutes? Okay. Any other discussion? All right. All those in favor of approving the minutes as edited, say aye.
Aye.
All those,
Hi.
thanks. All those opposed? Okay, excellent. Moving on. Okay, the only thing about everything together, I'm doing a lot of scrolling here. The next thing are citizens' comments. Do we have anybody? We have four.
Oh, you're not, okay.
Let's see, do we have anybody in attendance tonight that would like to make a citizen comment? And then Cameron, can you click on that participants just to see who's here? Oh, good. Okay. All right. Well, if you think of something you want to say later, we'll have citizen comments at the end also. I will move on from here. All right, a report from our city council liaison. Councilmember Bowden.
Hello, just a few things. Things have been pretty quiet, but we are embarking on our budget process, which is a big deal, really important. And we have to figure out in these tough economic times, what does our budget and our estimates for 2023 and 2024 for, city expenses, salaries, other activities, what is that going to look like? So this is an important process for us. We actually have to get it done by November. So there'll be pretty intensive meetings, starting with the proposed budget that comes to us from the mayor. So that's the first step in the process. There will be many opportunities for public input. I was involved in the last 2-year budget, and I will say there were kind of a handful of people who followed it, but not handfuls. So, where there's intersection with the work of the planning commission, I'll try to keep you apprised and let you know. Last time around, we did talk about electrification of our police vehicles when we developed the budget, but we really, we actually buy used vehicles from other wealthier bigger cities often for our police department. So it's a challenge. And I think that's why the legislative agenda to help fund climate change initiatives, I think will rise to a lot of the forefront of our legislative agenda, and the same for other small cities. The tree ordinance is up for modification. Just an FYI, there's nothing you really need to know about it. It's kind of, for the most part, housekeeping changes. I think the first presentation from staff of ordinance language is going to be Thursday. And we have discussed it once in a working session. The one area where we're cautious about the recommendations is the tree board recommended that we change some of the dimensions of the significant trees that require more regulatory action. And there are reasons, because the previous diameters went through an extensive technical process with an extensive record. There might be some, reluctance to make changes there. So I just flagged that ahead of time. That's the only issue of kind of major significance where I think overall they're excellent recommendations that we're taking up. So no big deal there. Nick, you may know more about this. I saw on our agenda that we're looking at adopting the updated state building code. So,
I know I am on the periphery a little bit, so I have talked to the building official just in passing about apparently they're bringing some updates to the building code. So things like the fee structure,
okay.
and then some probably things that have to do with state and local amendments. I think it will probably come your way via the building official.
Yes. So I'm flagging it, but I know nothing about it because I did not have advance notice myself, and so it was something I saw on the upcoming agenda. So I'm sure I'll have more to share at our next meeting. On walkways and sidewalks, one thing that that several council members, including myself, have brought up on a number of occasions is when we do street overlays. We use some of our transportation funding to do a regular series of street overlays, so we don't have to completely resurface streets. It's much better to do an overlay than to have to rebuild a road. So we have actually a sequence of priorities that we go through. But the question was, can we already are doing a surface. Can we put a curb for a walkway in appropriate places? Are there ways to, depending on the location, to enhance the walkways or possibly even the bicycle pathways associated with our street overlay program, recognizing that we might not get through as many projects if we add those, but are they perhaps only marginal costs that would be worthwhile? And at least should that be considered for each of our street overlay projects? So I do think that will continue to get traction. I think there are enough council members who care about that, or have raised or joined into that thought. So I think our public works director will be talking with us more about that. So that's all I have really. Just nothing. Oh, and I am awaiting the sign ordinance recommendations and memo so that I can make sure that some representatives of the planning commission can participate with Steve or Nick in presenting that to the council and answering any questions. I remember how complicated it was, and I suspect that the council will have to, chew on it a little bit to understand it. So that is, we don't have any of those dates agendas yet. I think we're awaiting the recommendation package, but then with the budget discussions, we'll have to kind of fit that in, because we're having a lot of extra budget meetings. So Anyway, just welcoming that whenever it's ready. Any questions?
I have a follow-up question if you don't mind.
Uh-huh.
First of all, I just want to say, I always appreciate your updates. And always give me an insight of what's happening with the council. I appreciate that. My follow-up question is, at the June meeting, you mentioned that the council has embarked on the strategic planning process.
Yes, it's on hold.
It's on hold, okay, okay. But I just wanted to recommend her to review the, at least as you mentioned, the top 5
Yes. Yes.
top priority items, which include sidewalks.
Yes. Listening to the community better.
Yeah.
And I forgot what the third one was because
We have them in our notes.
Yes, you have them in your notes, yes. And I was trying to get master planning for the lakefront park added as a fourth. And because I think that's going to, we do anticipate, by the way, getting the money we've been kind of promised from the county sometime in the fall, going into winter. So my thought is that master planning process will start in 2023. But we really don't want to jump the gun until we have funding. But in the meantime, the Parks Board, of which I am also the liaison, did yoga in the parks for the first time this Saturday at Animal Acres. And for those of you who haven't noticed that, it's the city is, people are volunteering some of their time. The city has helped defray some of the costs. It was a complete initiative from the Parks Board. They made it happen. And I think it's like 9 Saturdays. So next Saturday at 9 o'clock in the morning, 50 people showed up for the first one this past Saturday. So I encourage you to look on the city website if you're interested, or show up at 9 o'clock on Saturday. We have different instructors every time, so because they are kind of semi-volunteering their time. So, and it's good for beginners. Someone who's never done yoga, just bring a mat. You don't need to know anything. It's not going to be,
It was fun enough to better activate the trip as a part of the program.
Yes, the goal is to get people more interested and more engaged in the parks. The other thing they've been doing, we have a pickleball advocate in our Parks Board, and so the city has cleaned up the tennis courts and will be restriping them so that they can also be used for pickleball. So
My kitchen overlooks the pickleball court and Horizon View. I mean, 7 a.m. until 9.
that's what
Yeah, it is.
I had no idea, really. I wasn't paying attention to the popularity of pickleball, but apparently, apparently it's just in use every daylight hour. So anyway, that's what's the diversion. So
Sure.
not really an answer to your question, but
Well, can I come back just to one of the commitments? I know it's on hold for the conversation about the strategic planning, but I just, could you share just a little bit more about what the commitment is around communication between the public and the cities? Like, what's the ideal, what's the vision for that? And what's the-
I think some of the concern is that we have had times, like when we were dealing with the town center, other activities where we have a lot of community engagement. And the pandemic has put a damper on everything, right? Because you can't just drop by City Hall, and people weren't meeting with each other and so forth. But what we have noticed is recently that we have limited community comment and engagement right now. And yet to us, it seems like we have still some big issues percolating. So the mayor has started doing again coffee with the mayor, and the plan is for a city council member to always be there for that. But I do think we need to develop the implementation actions. What are those things that we can do? So I was not the only one who recommended that the Climate Action Committee, for example, look at the survey that the Planning Commission had done, because you got such great responses. The comments were what were, I think, so valuable. And we are developing a new stormwater management plan right now, which you may or may not have heard about, but it's required by the Department of Ecology. We absolutely have to identify, sources and management plans and do inspections. And we have tried to do public outreach on that, and the materials are actually really good, but practically no one is very engaged in that. So we're searching. If people have ideas, we do have the alerts now. If you sign up for them, I think they're very useful. Some of them make their way to Shoreline Area News. I think Nextdoor used to be more active, but to me, this is Lori's personal opinion. It's kind of, the discourse has kind of deteriorated a little bit, so I don't think we're using that as much. And so I think at the point where we are moving ahead with a draft document, we'll be looking for input on what would be most useful, because, and maybe the answer is we need more hugely controversial issues.
Or just have there ever been a discussion on like town hall, because the council meetings are more business. It's not really a two-way conversation. But I think about during the election season, there was like this, that may be a way of.
I think that's a great idea, and actually, I think if Friends of Third Place can host it, I think that it gets more people engaged than just the city announcing is having a meeting. We're not necessarily the best at being the best hosts. So I think that's a really good suggestion, but it's a work in progress. I'm sure, David, if you have suggestions, send them to our deputy mayor, Tom French. Or I can communicate them. I don't need to be flipped. So.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Melissa or Walter, do you have questions or comments for Councilmember Bodie? Walter?
I don't have any questions. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, please. Okay, I have just a couple. Like, go last. I wondered on the tree ordinance, is any of that work or the recommendations that are happening, do those have any crossover with work that's in our purview? Like, should we anticipate looking at those, or will that go directly?
No,
to
I think
council?
they're going directly to council, and they're smart changes, but honest. To make the program operate more efficiently. One I can remember is it used to be that there was geotechnical work required for every kind of application, and now that's not required in all cases, because we learned from experience. So,
Okay.
Can I ask when was the last time that was updated?
before this, within a matter of years, I think, there may have been an update when I first joined the council, so not very long. It's not like the ADU ordinance or design ordinance where it took a very long time to come back to it. So the tree board is very proactive and willing to make recommendations. So not very long, maybe 4 or 5 years.
And if I could just interject real quick, because I was.
Oh, you were?
chair.
Yeah.
So, the recommendations are quite recent. And actually, they were submitted just before COVID. And of course, the review was delayed.
Put on. Yeah.
Thank you. I just ask if any of those are like for non-RUE, because I know that's what we're thinking of, but for non-RUE, when a developer, takes trees off of a property, new houses are built and small trees are planted, is that part of the tree ordinance? Because there's no follow-up on that. Those are just little trees that may or may not survive.
They've had conversations about that.
So that may or may not be part of a recommendation, but it
It's
was
not
taken
part
up.
of the recommendation, but it is.
I will sidetrack us some discussion. Great. On the curve idea you had, is that what y'all are talking about? Kind of like what you see on 178 by Julian's house, just like a concrete curve?
Yes, or another place you can see one is like on 35th, that little spur of 35th
Right.
that cuts over towards local 104.
And are you assessing different things like big bumps versus concrete curves?
At this point, I think we're just going to wait to hear from Public Works to initiate consideration and discussion of that. So I'm sure we'll hear more as it goes forward, perhaps during the budget discussion, because there are direct budget implications for that. So,
And I saw in the notes the mention of traffic being one of the pieces. Could we simply come to the council meetings to find out what you have in mind with traffic, or is that just a pin and an issue right now?
no, right, I should have addressed this. The first things that we were talking about from a traffic point of view are speed limits. So Deputy Mayor Tom French has really looked into what it would take, the new methodologies for determining speed limits, and that have been used by the city of Seattle, for example, to make 25 miles an hour kind of a default speed limit for regular streets, shall we say, non-speedy arterial streets. There's three different definitions of streets, and I can't remember what they all are. Connector streets, arterial streets, and regular streets. And what they're doing that not because they want to have more police enforcement, but because information shows people tend to drive about 10 over the speed limit. So if you reduce the posted speed limit, it does reduce speed on the streets. So that's one thing that's being considered. We do have some connector streets and some arterial streets, so we handle those separately into one of these more innovative surveys that take a look at usage of the street, not just, it used to be it was some kind of mechanical, how fast are 85% of the cars going, or something like that. Don't quote me on that. And this is a more diverse checklist of how the street is being used and how you would determine the speed limit. So for our arterials and our connector streets, we would, of which there aren't that many, we would be looking at those. We do talk about cut-through traffic, but I don't think we have a specific topic that we're discussing on that right now. It's just on the list of things that we want to pay attention to. But the last thing that we were talking about is lowering the speed limit on Buffalo Way. How do you go about doing that with state DOT? And you have to go through a fairly lengthy process, but pretty much those of us who don't live that far from that road know everyone goes at least 50. And there are times we have pedestrian crossings at multiple places, especially very active in the summer. And so, can we do something about that? The discussion about Ballinger past the flashing start going 30 sign, kind of towards I-5. Council members who have been around for a while have said that the ability to change that in the near term with Department of Transportation, the prospects are not good. So there's some history there that I don't know. There's also going to be there's a traffic circle design in process for that 5-way intersection on Ballinger at 40th. And I have not seen the design, but I think we're taking a fresh look at it because we have new staffing compared to how that project started. But that is in the works, and hopefully eventually we'll get funding for that to move ahead with that. And that will slow traffic, but also make that intersection safer. I'm worried about it, but there are people who design these things better than me. One other traffic circle issue, I'm sorry, you got me on this. This is kind of amazing to me. On 145th at I-5, where we have 2 traffic lights now and where the light rail station is going in, instead of traffic lights, Shoreline and Sound Transit are going to have traffic circles on either side of I-5. I hope it works. But, it does seem like a place I might avoid. Maybe that's why it works. Anyway, those are the kind of the topics, and they're actively under discussion. I think that the council member French is really, wants to push to do something. So, and he, gets deference as the deputy mayor, and I think the rest of the council is very much in support. So, so things will be happening.
Well, thank you. And we'll get caught up with this week. Okay, well, let's move into old business. We've got just over an hour left to tackle our lease. And it looks like you guys, sounds like I listened to the meeting, you'll have some really great discussion. So you want to kick us off with?
Well, yeah, you wanted me to update you on the site just first of all, we talked about at the public hearing and some issues came out of the public hearing as well as discussion. So the staff, we said that we could move along with the recommendations to the code, bringing those to council. We wanted to supplement with memorandum that talked about some of the things that came out of the hearing, so that the council could consider those. So we're still drafting that memo. Steve left for vacation just a couple of weeks ago. We just had a couple of weeks before he left for vacation, so we didn't get a chance to bring the draft through this time. So hopefully the next meeting we'll be able to bring that draft for you guys.
Great. And then we will schedule it some point after that.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Excellent.
And so then the other part was the reasonable use code and some alternative and couple of drafts that we made to the existing code. While we're, as long as we're adding to and amending the code, we also, make it a point to take a look at the entire thing, just in case, just to provide some clarity and some context to amendments. We'll take an opportunity and we'll amend what we feel, is language that could be easier to deal with, stuff that might be difficult to interpret. So basically, the strikeouts that you see, anything that's basically before the new additions, those strikeouts and additions were done by City Attorney Pratt. So she, in conjunction with some of the other work that she's done on reasonable use and seeing what some of the other cities have been putting in their codes, recommended these small changes to the sections of the intermediate here. So you'll see that there, strikeouts and underlines. And then we talked a bit about having a owner occupancy requirement for improved RUVs, and so that's where G came out of. I did talk to City Attorney Pratt and wrote my memo. She felt that maybe we could discuss alternatives to this particular section because it's a bit maybe intrusive to require someone to live in a property for minimum amount of 5 years, or typically these mitigation projects last 5 years. So maybe some discussion can occur on that, on where we can take that, so it's not so intrusive, I should say. And then the idea of financial securities for bonding these properties that's pretty common. So we feel like that would be a good tool to get somebody invested in mitigation, have them post financial security so their money's on the line. If it fails, we have an opportunity to pull that bond, use those funds to restore the site or to whatever maintenance needs to be done. But that would at least put rather than chasing these things as an enforcement action, so that at least allow these people to be invested in the process, be responsible for what's out there, and if they choose not to be, then we have a financial recourse to go after and do the project ourselves. So because it's really tough to do this as an enforcement action after the fact, right? Especially if these properties get sold off, these property owners, they don't know, they really have no idea. Probably don't even know that they bought a reasonable use property. They just thought there was some mitigation there. So that kind of transitions us into the next one, which is, and this is pretty common too. I've seen this in a lot of places, but when there is an approval gets recorded against the property's title. And so when people buy these properties, they're supposed to be reading their title. So it would be on there. And that I think would at least cover the lifetime time of the property. So everyone who would ever come across that property would know. But really beyond that, there wasn't any additional discussion in terms of like code amendments. So that's what we have for you in terms of amendments.
Can I just ask a clarifying question on item G? You had said that the city attorney Pratt was a little uncertain about that. Is that still a question or?
Yeah, she thought that the commission could discuss some alternatives on that, and yeah, she was a little uncomfortable with the way that I drafted it. She thought that it was a little bit
Unreasonable.
yeah, probably
I mean, in the term
unreasonable.
of reasonable, unreasonable, yeah.
It was probably a stretch to think that you make something nice.
Right.
Legally.
Right.
So.
I have to say, when I first read it, we pushed back on
Yeah.
that. Right. Did the attorney Pratt make any other recommendations?
No, she
Okay.
didn't. She that's all she said about it. So
Okay. Okay.
she did recommend that we discuss it, and come up with some possible alternatives.
Did you guys, were you able to look into what other cities might have?
Yeah, you know, a lot of the other cities, I mean, of comparable size population, like, our ordinances are fairly similar. You know, by way of state law, there's certain things you can and can't do, and so these RUE codes are sort of framed around what can be done at the state level. So it's pretty typical of what you see in other cities the same similar size and population.
Please go ahead.
Well, I actually did read through a couple other cities, and I was gonna mention that because no other city has a statement like that where, you know, it has to be the property owner. And I was thinking, well, what if, you know, what if the builder wants to build it, that kind of excludes them, which maybe that was, what if it's just a, you know, clear that it's going to be at least 5 years where the property is going to be, you know, continual looking into or more. That seems to be, you know, in all of consistent, the mitigation, maintenance, and monitoring of 5 years seems to be common language.
Yeah, you're gonna find that because, yeah, like I said, a lot of these restoration plans take about 5 years to mature, you know, a few growing seasons for this, you know, vegetation. And so typically after about 5 years, the wetland specialist or whoever you're working with is gonna say, okay, this has reached, you know, full maturity, it's performing the way it's supposed to perform after the 5 years.
That the mitigation has reached maturity, not necessarily the plant matter or that, but it's on its way. The mitigation is.
5 years is about the timetable that they like to see these mitigation plans in place for and maintained. And then after, it could be like kind of let go, out to be sent to the property owners, weed out the invasives and stuff like that. Because the invasives will always come, you know, it's kind of like landscape property, right? You have to always keep up with it or else it'll just overgrow. Sure. Yeah. But during the 5 year period, it's important that plants are allowed to be established and thrive through that first 5 years.
And that's that piece, but what about the building side of that? So that's the plant material, but then what's the other end of like not adding, you know, more impervious surface or outbuildings or, you know, other actual, you know, changes, building changes to a lot.
Yeah, so that's where I comes in. When you have a decision from the examiner that references a site plan, it gets put on the property's title, and so the property is not supposed to change beyond that configuration.
And usually in my experience, what happens is that a neighbor will call on
Right.
somebody who's being approached on it.
Right.
Right. Can we go back to H for just a second? And it's kind of a question, but so we're looking at the ownership, the owners of the property being accountable for whatever maintenance is required, right? Is there any onus on developers at this point? Like, is the developer that has to put this mitigation in place? Right. So,
So it's the owner, whoever owns the property, right?
right. So the developer does what the developer does, right? And then that property sold off. So it's the owner of that property that's now accountable for the maintenance.
David, you bring up a good
point.
developer, who is the property owner, put the money forward with a financial security or guarantee, if they sell that before that 5-year period is up, do they get that money back and the new property owner has to replace it, or is that guarantee, like, how is it gonna work? If they
We
sell-
don't, as long as it's secured and we can have access to funds, we don't care who is responsible.
Yeah, this is fairly typical of other municipalities, and that's basically placed in escrow. And so it's kind of, it's a civil matter between the previous owner and the new owner, how they settle that. So it's if a developer wants to come in, develop the property under an RUE, that's really the cost of their doing business. And so it's kind of an encumbered cost for them, on the sale. It's kind of, they have to make that decision on how they kind of pencil out, the return on their investment that way.
We have access to those funds, we don't really care, because if mitigation goes out, if it goes, something happens, we want to be able to have access to it, so we need to take care of the problem. And, whoever's responsible, sure.
And if I can just kind of follow up on something else, those funds that are put up to kind of, I guess, protect the mitigation plan and, fix anything that's taken care of. The idea is that it protects it for that 5 years, but the long-term impact to any changes to that property, are covered under the other ordinances, like critical use area ordinances in the code. And those are supposed to kind of protect the long-term impacts of that property and even other developed properties that weren't developed under an RUE that have critical areas. This is just kind of to make sure that the development practices in the short term, I think, maintain what was agreed upon during the RUE process.
Walter, I guess, well, first, Melissa, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think Nick might have answered my question when he was discussing, it was just about the 5 years. And I think I heard him say that Attorney Pratt was not comfortable with that long of a time period. And did she want to shorten that? Is that what you were saying?
She just said that it might be a bit of an overreach to require somebody to live somewhere for any amount of time.
We could discuss alternative ways to achieve what we're trying to achieve without asking for a residency requirement.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, and then I want to pop back over to Walter for a second. Walter, are you suggesting that, or I guess let me rephrase that, kind of a what if situation. If I built, through an RUE and I was close to a wetland or a stream, something different than what would normally be allowed by our critical areas ordinance, what recourse does the community have if that property owner 5-10 years from now is not maintaining practices on their property that ensure the water quality and safety? Because I'm thinking of this property that Jolene brought forward where they were right on the creek. I'm just curious if you've seen anything that helps guarantee anything with water quality there.
Well, I would say, in those instances, that owner in 15 years, it has the same responsibilities to their critical areas that, a neighbor who didn't have to follow an RUE process because they had a, different lot layout, but still has critical areas on their property has to follow. The RUE process is really just there to allow development in those lots, to an environmental standard. And then the mitigation plan is to kind of, ensure that the mitigations that were agreed upon are followed for a period long enough for them to be sustainable. And then long-term, it's the critical area use ordinances that govern that property just the same as every other property with critical areas on them. Like my property was developed in 1965. It has critical areas on it because of steep slopes and erosion hazards. But I didn't have to follow any RUE process, but any changes that I want to make to my property, would have to follow critical use ordinances just the same as anyone else. And so that's how my property is protected long-term without going through an RUE process.
Does that make sense? Because we're only talking about properties that are getting developed.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking about ones that are, totally encumbered, where we've got to allow some sort of development, and there's almost in many ways no way to totally mitigate the impacts, particularly if they're, directly adjacent to a stream and the slope, like it seems like 5 years isn't enough, for a property like that.
Yeah, and you might want to consider extending that. I mean, 5 years is typically like the amount of time that wetland and stream mitigation take to mature. So that's why 5 years is used a lot.
Right.
So I'm just thinking about the case. I have a judgment of this. Right? Do you know that? Oh yes, sorry. That there was this case that there was this mitigation. It was critical streams. And actually, that was governmental waters on this property. So this property is mitigated. This critical area also extends into the neighbor's yard, and the mitigation impacted that area, right? But there was no, there was no repercussions for them. There was no way to mitigate the long-term repercussions of that mitigation. And I don't know that just might be a totally other conversation actually, as I think about it. But how does the city address issues that show up because of the mitigation on neighboring critical area?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when we're talking about RUEs and stuff, we're really just talking about whatever property that is getting developed.
Right, and it was an RE. Well, actually, I should say that because I don't remember.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so I guess what's the question? I'm sorry.
Well, so who's responsible for a mitigation that impacts neighboring?
You would have to discuss that and disclose whatever impacts their development's having on a neighboring property. Yeah, through their critical areas.
Well, we're talking about 5 years down the line. We're talking this mitigation is taking place 10 years ago at this point. And it's impacting overall health.
Yeah, I don't know that the city would get involved in something like that. We could see like a stipulation between property owners.
Can we put a pin in this? Because
Yes,
I think what we're sort of talking around, it feels like, jump in if you think differently, but we're saying because of the nature of land in Lake Forest Park, not all encumbered properties are the same. What makes the critical area is often very unique property by property. And so I think what we're talking about is for those that have really tenuous circumstances, like very steep slopes that are always going to be sandy slopes, even 5 years later. It might be a long enough time for many properties, but there might be some that have profound effects on neighbors beyond 5 years, because it's a very in the case I'm thinking of in my head, a very steep sandy slope that is not going to necessarily be guaranteed in year 6. So maybe we could put a pin in talking about that being possibly one of the mitigations that is put in a longer monitoring time. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say that because all of the information, all of the reports and everything are gonna go before the hearing examiner, and he's really gonna be the one that should, this neighbor should, submit a report saying these are the, projected effects to my property, and so he's gonna be, or she's gonna be the one to kind of weed through all of that nitty-gritty of the individual cases.
Individual pieces with the caveat that if it's typical that 5 years is sort of the maximum monitoring period, they may not consider a longer monitoring period, and at least it sounds like a couple of us are saying maybe that is something they should consider as a mitigation, is a longer monitoring period. Yeah.
I have a question just that comes out of the work I used to do, because I used to acquire restoration properties.
And except for building sites, I would put them under permanent conservation easement. And so one question I have, related to and this may be, I am not knowledgeable about this, so I'm just throwing it out there, which is if we do have critical areas that really we want to protect permanently, could the condition of the reasonable use exemption be putting those designated areas that are critical under conservation easement, which gives you a little extra protection? And it's permanent, it's something that is permanent. There's some advantage to them because it affects, property taxes, but so do the critical areas, right? So.
We have that in our code too,
Yeah.
and if they subdivide, it's required.
Yes,
So, but
Yeah.
it's not in this particular
I
section.
understand.
Yeah.
I'm just
That's
saying,
a
is
good
that
idea.
something? And then, David, I would just say, like, if your neighbor has trees that fall down on your property or water that comes onto your property because they cleared too many trees, they are liable to you as the adjacent property.
What if it's a subsequent owner, 3 owners down?
It's the current owner when the failure occurs.
If a tree in my yard right now fell on my neighbor's house, but it was on my property, I would be liable.
Well, you would want to talk to your neighbor and figure out how to remove it.
I thought you were getting at a legal.
I am a little bit, which is something that originates on your property that vibrates to your neighbor's property. Whoever owns it at that time has responsibility.
Thank you. Walter, jump in.
Yeah, I guess there was a lot there. Oh gosh. Let's come back to me and we'll move on.
Okay, Meredith, you were missing.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I noticed when I was reading a couple of the other cities' codes was that they had an additional, so we have 4. And you mentioned subdivision, because a lot of the cities will have there'll be usually a 5th that it should, that the examiner shall grant an exception only if, and it'll be something like the need for the variance is not the result of actions of the applicant or the property owner. So they just have that language in there. So if you subdivided or something, and that is the reason why you are needing this reasonable exemption, you can't have it. So I noticed that almost every single city had that kind of language in there.
Like if your underlying property is eligible for subdivision, but it would leave one property as.
Well,
You
so
subdivide.
That's
and part of your one of the subdividable lots has to have a reasonable use exemption to get a building on it. Right?
We have something like that in there, but it's not as clear as that. I believe it says lands fully located in critical areas cannot be subdivided. So it's not quite as clear as that would be.
But that's in the subdivision code, not this.
No, it's in the critical areas code. Yeah.
Walter, did you have your thoughts together?
Yes, I did. So to say typically that kind of language that was just discussed about, variances typically relates to administrative modification and variances with city code. So I think it could tie in. But the question about conservation areas, those typically, I think, as Nick said, come up into play when you're subdividing parcels, and that's not something that typically is done in an RUE fashion because you're really looking at building one reasonable house, no matter the size of a lot, which means that you're not able to generally subdivide those lots. And then because you're being permitted to build the reasonable, typically single family home on that lot, and once that's done, the door is closed to further development. So I don't know if there's really a need for a conservation area for RUE building or RUE lots, because once we allow development, there's no further development allowed on the lot. There's no further subdividing. There's no subplatting, that parcel's done.
Well, let me push back on on that a little bit. So at where I work, we were given by the university some property, and we were aware that unless some of the property that we did not build on, which was environmentally sensitive, as us, as a natural history museum, wanted to protect in particularly oak growth. And so we worked to put that in a conservation easement so it couldn't be taken. And so I wonder if conservation easements allow the community at large more certainty that code changes that might allow for further development, you know, if it wouldn't happen there.
Yeah, I think where I've seen conservation easements used in the past is typically kind of like in a horse trading scenario where a developer wants to subdivide a larger lot where you have certain areas of a parcel that could be developed under, you know, they don't meet like the lot density lot sizes. So you're maybe putting a larger house on a smaller lot over, you know, a large parcel. So let's say you're developing in an area that has its zoned for RS 9600 or something. So each lot should be close to 10,000 square feet or larger. And you're developing a lot that's 50,000 square feet. So you should be able to put 5 houses on there, but 30,000 square feet of that lot is critical area. So where the conservation easement would sometimes come in is you say, well, I can fit 2 full houses on these 2 lots, subdivide those, and they meet the 10,000 square foot requirements. And I could fit 3 on these other ones. And, you know, maybe where you land is instead of having 1 on that 30,000, you can put 2 in the remaining, and then you make a conservation area. So you're kind of, you get those exceptions. So the developer can build a little bit more, you preserve some of the density in that area, and you're preserving the conservation nature of it. But it's tied back into subdividing a lot and the developer kind of giving up something, but getting some exceptions to other parts of the code. But when somebody comes in purely for RUE, they can't really even fit 1 house on a given lot.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, if we were working on our subdivision code, we might want to tie into that. But I think since we're just working on RUE, unless I'm misunderstanding that if an applicant is coming in looking for an RUE, that property was already something's already happened. At this point, anything that would be divided, or there would be an application for subdivision, that assessment would be done relative to critical areas, and that would dictate whether or not it can be subdivided, right? So that's a separate area that we're not working on right now.
Well, we're just working on lots that are entirely encumbered.
Okay.
But I mean, Walter talks a lot of, he's talking about a lot of things that do happen during the subdivision process. But we, in LFP, like a lot of those projects that you're describing, Commissioner Hicks, we just don't have like the kind of big parcels like that. We're really just dealing with ones, twos here and there, and then RUEs mainly. So that's, we don't see a whole lot of that stuff where a lot of the other places like Bothell and stuff is sure do a lot of that.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think, yeah, to put a bow on it, I guess my point was, I don't think that's, you know, going down the road of talking about conservation areas for the RUEs is something that we necessarily need to concern ourselves with because of the scale that what we have left for development in the city.
Councilmember Bodie, are conservation easements, would that be considered a burden for a developer to obtain?
Oh, I think procedurally it's fairly easy to do. Okay. Yeah, I don't think it's a burdensome process. The question is if you record the site map or whatever it is and conditions, does that give, you know, an extra degree of security that, as you point out, if the code changes or, you know,
The monitoring's over.
the monitoring's over and they want to expand, that would would be an extra protection against that retreat or
Usually use that,
expansion. Yeah, so that's I think the way I see it. So what's the incremental benefit as
Right.
Commissioner Hicks says, I think is the question.
Well, I think this leads back to a question I had of all of you when you were talking last month. Item D talks about, and nothing's changed on this, but it was something that didn't come up in conversation that I could discern that I was interested in. And it was some sort of conversation on what we mean by reasonable and what criteria is used, what mitigation is sufficient. And so I think that's in many ways a toolbox. And it's something that's very opaque to me right now, what those parameters are. And I was hoping that, as a group, we might consider, some measures or recommendations that could provide more definition on reasonable and use and what is actually sufficient from a mitigation standpoint. And I wondered if y'all thought about that or talked about it and I just missed it.
Actually, I think we talked around it. I know that I asked a question that I didn't ask clearly enough to get to that. But I would be really interested about other cities defining what that means. I don't know. Did you see anything about that, Meredith?
Well, so I was just reading their definition of the process, and I really think that the hearing examiner or whoever is in charge of the actual process is the one that's making those calls, because he or she is the one that is, they have to have all kinds of documentation, all kinds of studies, and they're gathering all that information, and so I think this is kind of just more outlining the process, and they are really the ones that are doing that hard work of deciding.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though, the hearing examiner is taking a report from the staff and community comment. They're not experts that are diving in to do a thorough, analysis of the property and
Well, so it's a little bit of both, I guess. We do provide our analysis of how they meet the criteria of approval for their RUB. We evaluate their critical area study to determine, how far it off is for meeting our requirements. And then, when we do figure out from RUBs, obviously they can't meet all of the requirements. Is it best available science? Have sound? They're actually using sound judgment. Are they providing appropriate level of mitigation? And we take into account those sorts of things in our report. And ultimately, we recommend whatever we do with our certain conditions. And so, we talked a little bit about it last time, but the examiner a lot of times will eliminate conditions and add new ones, based on his experience. So currently, our hearing examiner is John Gall. He's been doing this for close to 50 years. So he's seen, any development that is out there really in this region. So they have a really good idea about what's appropriate for these sites, in conjunction with all the studies and stuff they get. They're able to make a pretty sound assessment of the site.
So then, following up on your question, though, if we were to clarify what reasonable means, would that would that impact decisions that the examiner makes?
It would be like if you were adding additional criteria of approval, the applicant would have to demonstrate compliance with those criteria, and then you'd want to ask the city attorney to those criteria appropriate based on whatever state precedent is set. Just like our reach with the owner occupancy. That might be a good idea.
yeah, maybe not. Interesting. I still think there's something there. I think it would be nice if, and we can't stick a pin in this, but if we call, maybe do some reading, look at some other cities' codes and find out, are they providing any definitions or, guardrails, terms, criteria around reasonable use of mitigation that, is absent right now. I mean, as a citizen of our community, when I read the code, I don't know what that means. I don't like it. It seems pretty mushy. planning department, like what guidelines are you currently working with, and how can we make those more visible to the community, or help shore them up if they can be strengthened. So anyway, that was just something I wanted to ask you.
So Samantha, I still want to follow. Are you asking the city to provide with us with that information, or are you asking us?
I think just it would be really great if our partners in the building department could offer some ideas, but I also think Meredith, is doing something that we've all, done in the past too, which is spend some time looking around at other cities and see how it may be in their front matter for the code, but how are they setting that up so that our community understands what reasonable is and what sufficient mitigation is. And just maybe it's more of an education piece than something that's hard to pass. But every other thing that I'm sure I'd love to hear what you have to say on this front, but everything that we do in our professional world has criteria associated with it, and I haven't seen that yet.
It's exactly on that point. To me, as someone who doesn't know the process and hasn't been involved, how big a building does it have to be reasonable? Is 800 square feet? Okay, we have 800 square feet houses.
We need that
here, and we need some smaller properties. Is it okay if it has a footprint of 800 square feet, but it goes up a story? Is it 1,200 square feet? There could be. Our city attorney could know some kind of guidelines. Also, I would say hearing examiner Galt is very experienced, but there are lots of inexperienced hearing examiners out there too, and we've been lucky. So he could retire for 5 years around, for example. So anyway, I just to me, I just as a council member, I have questions on how that size and configuration and so forth. How far do you have to go for a building to be reasonable, or how much can you minimize the building and still be reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a handful of these with Galt, and he sticks to 1,200 square foot at a footprint. And that's what we always go in with our recommendation, because that's the only thing he typically approves. I mean, I think you can find a couple of instances where he may have gone over 50 square feet on a footprint if somebody makes a good argument. But if somebody comes to us with an application that says, I want to build a 1,300 square foot footprint, we tell them that we're not going to recommend that because our examiner has approved that with us before. So you're going to have to try and make your site with 1,200 square foot.
But are all sites conducive to a 1,200 square foot footprint?
I think that's what he has determined typically is reasonable economic use for single family.
Right, so that's reasonable economic use for them. I mean, but I naturally want to argue and be like, says who? Says who? I mean, we have a house next door that's got a footprint of 800 square feet. You could go up to still end up with a 1,600 square foot house. And so anyway, I want to challenge some of the assumptions of what's reasonable, particularly given that the types of lots that have come forward to the hearing examiner historically may not be the same types of lots that come forward now as there's been more and more pressure for building. So again, we don't have to solve that tonight, but I want us to think about, like, what does it reasonable mean, and are there recommendations we can make, whether they're accepted or not, that we feel seem sound and progressive, for where we are now with our housing market and our housing needs. And Councilmember Bodie makes a great point. We've been looking for ways to create more inventory of smaller homes too. This may be another, means that accomplishes that.
And I think this visibility gives us a way to move forward on this as well. So, right. And additionally, I think this information is helpful for the public, because they might come to you and say, hey, where do I start? And I think Jolene's a good example of somebody who's really tried hard to do research, but I think that we can help address that. Like visibility is some of these requirements that would come up that you're working on. And certainly not to say that the city's not doing a good job, that the plan or government's not doing a good job. I think that it's just that the more that we can support what the city is doing, the better relationships that we're building with the
Can I ask a question? The hearing examiner has supported a 1,200 square foot footprint regardless of height, or 1,200 square feet for the
Footprint.
residence.
There's a height limit for zoning.
Right,
code, yeah.
right. So automatically that's could be more than 2,400 square feet because of the residential height limit.
Yeah, right, so it's the
Okay.
footprint, that's
Yeah,
essentially
that's
the
fairly
area.
large.
in-
I'm just saying, that's as large, that's larger than my house right now, which is a 1930s.
To me, it doesn't honor the reasonable use. It's sort of saying, well, that a normal house did. Walter, I want to bring you into this. Sorry.
Yeah. So the point I wanted to bring up is that while we're talking about, particularly what size of residence is reasonable, not to lose sight of what the cost to a property owner is to go through the reasonable use exception. And if our goal is to provide a path that's provides additional housing inventory in our community, we don't want to overburden the process to where these sites become unfeasible for somebody to build even a small house or any house regardless of what the size is. And if my understanding is that going through an RUE process can cost well into 6 figures, we make things too restrictive, then we don't add any housing inventory. I think that by and large, a lot of people would agree that that's the opposite direction of where we want to go. So we want to do this environmentally consciously, but I think everyone agrees that we're looking to allow use of these properties.
Well, I think just to be clear, I don't think any of our conversation has indicated that we should somehow, put any measure up that would, try to get in the way of the state law. I think it's just that balance between what's reasonable, both in terms of use and in terms of mitigation. And the reality is if I'm building a building on a fault line, I've got seismic upgrades I've got to make. So that's the property that I have that I've got to account for. And so I think let's just keep that in mind. I don't think anyone would suggest that there are barriers we want to put in people's places, as much as saying that for these types of properties, right, there's lots of properties that this doesn't apply to, but for these very unique properties, it's incumbent upon us to figure out what's the balance between environmental responsibility and reasonable use of a sensitive area.
Yeah, and
Just want to check in with everybody here. Melissa, your hand is up.
Yeah, I guess it's just more of a comment because we're talking a lot about what would be reasonable use in terms of size. And I guess my comment is to keep in mind that we all have different opinions in terms of what type of size would be reasonable. I mean, the house we live in right now is quite large. We had to because we have 4 kids, but we have 2 that are getting ready to move out, and we'd love to downsize, and we can't find anything smaller right now in Lake Forest Park. Mostly there's just no inventory out there, and everything that's getting purchased, it gets snapped up really quickly. And so we're sort of stuck in this house that, is really too much for us, and we can't sell it and give it to somebody else because there's nothing smaller out there for us. So I guess it's more of a comment, as we talk about, what is a reasonable sized house, that's sort of, I think it's dependent on who's looking for the house. That's my only comment.
Thanks, Melissa. I think that's an important comment too, because reasonable use is a conversation that we might have with our regular building code for a regular parcel. Sort of what should we allow in terms of height and pervious versus impervious surface and so on. And I see what we're doing here as being very different than that, because in this case, the measure is not what's reasonable on a parcel that's not encumbered by critical area, but where we as stewards of the environment balance the reasonable use of the property with the environmental impacts. And we don't have as high of a bar in that way to reach for properties that aren't encumbered by critical areas. So anyway, just wanted to comment on that. Does anybody else want to jump into this or have questions or comments on topics before us? Do a little synthesis then. One of the things that we've done in the past, Meredith and Ashton, when we get down to sort of recommendations like this, we start looking at, items, or do we feel generally good about this item or does it need more work? And so I think, with this last 25 minutes we have, since there's just a couple of these and they have the recommendations that Nick has put together for us, maybe we could just take them that way, which will help make visible where the rest of our work needs to be. So, with the first item F was unchanged. Did anybody have any sort of comments or questions about F? Needs around it. I'm sorry, I did that very quickly. Walter and Melissa, do you have this code in front of you, these markups?
I have them. Yep.
The only comment I noted for F was that, maybe, and this is kind of farther down the road, just throw it out there, but it may be that one of the things we might do as a city is provide some, I don't know, like info sheets about, and maybe we do this and I just don't know, but that can help people understand their responsibilities, not, if they're building in these sensitive areas and they're having to get these approvals and get these special reports and so forth, that it might be helpful when they're, getting the application, that they also have a companion piece that helps give them the kind of my kids would shudder if they heard me say this, the 411 like building in environmentally sensitive areas that we can elevate that. So that was my only idea with F, is that we might add some sort of something to the community. Anyway.
Actually, I agree, Matt. One might ask, what's the purpose of that?
Yeah. Okay, what about G? This was Kim's piece. Are there other solutions that are kind of top of mind for any of you, or things you're curious about? Like, could we maybe do this instead? Or?
I guess just a level set, I think, was everyone here in agreement with that? I think not.
Yeah, I was gonna say my personal point of view is that I think we could focus on bolstering, what we have in H and take care of a lot of what we were trying to solve with G. I'll leave it at that.
I agree. Melissa? Okay, so we're all in agreement on G. G just go away.
Okay.
Okay. H. What are your feelings and opinions? Again, we're not necessarily looking for a solution right now, but on H.
I think that addresses exactly what we're talking about. So making something with a little bit of teeth in it, and financially speaking, 30%.
Yeah, my initial reading through of this, I just hate to penalize owners that haven't broken anything, and it's already really expensive to build on these properties, but at the same time, reading through, basically all the cities have something similar. In fact, I think it's a cost 150, so 130 is lower than some other cities are doing. Right, so 30% contingency. Okay, well, actually, let me just look. Yeah, so 30% on top of what so.
Yeah, the full cost, labor and
Right.
material, market
Plus-
value plus the
Plus 30%, right, so there are other cities that are doing additional 50%, so
Yeah.
30%.
Walter or Melissa?
No, I completely agree. I think, having that financial security takes care of, making sure that there's a good faith effort in making sure that those mitigations are successful. And I think, generally in the process, there's going to be enough eyes on that project and that mitigation plan, be it from the neighbors or, through this. My understanding is that the planning department annually reviews, each site to make sure they're complying with the mitigations. And so I think there's enough checks in that it can be successful. And I also think that in general, because of the, I'll just leave it there.
Great, Melissa?
Yeah, I also agree. I think at the last meeting, I don't remember if there was talk about if there's something that could be put on the title of the house to, prevent the sale. I thought that was like sort of mentioned in the meeting, but I don't know that that's a thing.
That's the next section down, letter I, be recorded against the property's title.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, there you go.
David. Do you have any input on H?
Oh, on H, no. Other than, I like that. That's
Yeah, it seems pretty sound. I have two questions on H. What are considered mitigations? Because that affects the financial guarantee, like. So I'd like to know that, and then I'd also like to know the second thing is if I'm the builder, I've come in, I've put this money into escrow, and 2 years from now I sell it. Does the city know I've sold it or not? And that is it just a transaction between myself and the buyer, or does the city get pulled into that transaction and has to like take some money out and give it to that person and have it replaced?
Yeah, good question. No, we wouldn't be involved in any of that. We just have access to the account. So, and then in terms of the mitigation question, it would be defined as whatever needed to be done to mitigate the project's impacts to the site. So we're talking about a wetland buffer. So I guess it would depend on what's being impacted. So mitigation ratios for impacts to direct wetlands are different than to buffers. So if we're talking about enhancement of a wetland, we're talking about mitigation of a buffer, it would depend on what the project's impacts are.
I think that would be the only thing that would be helpful, or one of the things that would be helpful in H, because I don't know what you're going to consider as the full mitigation, and then therefore the financial guarantee to change in value overall. Like, is it the retaining wall that I have to build to shore up a slope, or is it just the planting material? Is it a particular plumbing system to keep me from flooding my neighbor? Or, like what's implicated in mitigation and the guarantee?
So there's a mitigation plan that comes with the study. And then the financial security amount is based on a cost that's prepared by the qualified professional who does the mitigation plan.
This was last week. Last month, yeah, I think there was specific mitigation, so it's going to be case specific for every.
Absolutely. I just didn't know when you look at all of the mitigations on the site, what would require the financial guarantee.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was thinking, I've researched this, that sometimes, the mitigation plan is more about like the maintenance that's required to maintain, the landscaping that's maybe put in place, or if there's, a berm that's established. And so part of the person developing the lot proposes the mitigations, and those are agreed upon, but at the plans examination hearing. And the long-term mitigation plan is part of the value, I think, is tied often to the maintenance of that. And so that's sometimes where the value is. But and I think I remember reading that part somewhere in our code at one point. I apologize, I don't have it in front of me. I think that was part of the valuation, or a significant part of it. That way the city can pull that money. Like if the owner's not maintaining it themselves, then they can pull that money and implement that part of the maintenance of it or repair it.
Yeah, I was just curious that might be another community education piece. Related to H but separate, maybe it's another item. But I listened to your conversation about fines, and what I think, David, you had sort of brought this up, and Nick or Steve wanted to talk about, well, they can't start assessing fines until the city, which was just a step of 3, could actually, work on the problem at hand. And I wonder what we all think about having more, clearer terms and fines around violations. So if I'm somebody who's come to the city and applied and secured an RUV, I know what I'm allowed to do and not do. If it's part of my deed, and I know what's allowed and what's not allowed. So if I willfully violate the terms of how I'm allowed to use the land or maintain the mitigations, why would fines kick in right away, just like sleeping? And so I wonder, we need some, I guess, carrots, if you will, I think, for compliance, because the best I can see right now there aren't any real consequences if you break the rules, other than to have to mitigate it, and then that can be a whole process that you negotiate. But in the end, you got what you wanted, and I'm surprised that we don't have fines associated with that sort of willful violation.
We operate through the code enforcement check, which has the ability to fine.
But we don't fine.
We can, it has the ability to fine.
I think we should make a recommendation that we fine, because the best I can tell, the violations in our community have come from people who are willfully violating, they can't claim ignorance because they've just gone through the whole process where they know what they can and can't do on that property. So again, we don't have to solve it tonight, but I'd like to
just one comment on that. So one of the complaints of tree board is that there are fines for taking down trees that are supposed to be taken down, right? The complaint is that developers can afford that, whereas a property owner, it's not as easy for a property owner to be for sure. So that's fine. So I don't. There's a difference between, we talked a lot about this. This related compliance versus other sorts of ways of encouraging people to not break that.
The city hesitates to bring into fining too, because it involves so many different things, right? So you've got, this person can call for an appeal hearing, so you got to get the examiner involved, then you got our city attorney costs. And so it can snowball into this big, huge, costly process for the city. So that's why you don't see us jumping like finding people immediately through chapter 125, because it requires a bunch of resources to get to that point.
Right.
So
yeah, I was looking at the example that y'all, Walter, I see your hand up. I'll pull you in. The example that y'all were looking at last time is somebody who's around the corner from me, and they knew for a fact they shouldn't clear cut their slope. Several years after they moved in, they clear cut it, and I was just trying to find out, like, what do we do in that when somebody just so evidently does something they know they're not supposed to because they want to. There were no fines assessed. They just had to plan. And I thought, how, like, as a community, that behavior at scale is not very sustainable. And so I just wanted to explain to you, like some of my thinking. I might be wrong, and might be the only one, that feels this way, but it seems to me that there should be some sort of consequence for willfully violating the very code that we're working on here. Walter, did you have something on point?
Yeah, I would lead off by saying I completely agree with the chair on this point, that, I don't agree that we are adequately protecting or assessing repercussions for those types of actions. But I think that those protections, though, live in a different part of the code than what we're discussing today. And this is really, if we can, work with the city council, get it onto work plan to look at, the other parts of the code that it is in, which is, I think, the critical use area of the code, where we start protecting a lot of those things. I think we could do some additional meaningful work in how those are protected. Because, you know, one thing that I've seen with the code that I wish we could change is, you know, when somebody takes down a tree, you know, if they take down even you know, through the proper actions, they take down a Douglas fir or a cedar, you know, for one reason or another, it's fully approved and permitted. You know, they're allowed to plant any other type of tree in its place. So you could take down a 200-foot tall tree that's blocking a view of a mountain and put in its place, you know, an apple tree that never gets bigger than 10 feet tall. And those aren't equal in any way to its environmental impact, but they're completely legal options that are permitted. And I think they all kind of tie together with what you're talking about. So I would like to see us maybe get the ability to kind of talk about those issues, you know, later on in the year. If we can't talk about them, maybe they're perfect for the tree board to talk about or the city council to talk about. I think they're meaningful conversations. I just think that they're kind of beyond the scope of what we have.
Okay, thanks so much, Walter. Melissa.
Yeah, I have one comment, and one is regarding the tree removal, because we've had to have several trees removed from the property due to, you know, disease and safety reasons. And we've never, I'm not sure what arborist anyone else has worked with, but we have not necessarily had an easy time with removing trees that are even a danger to our neighbors. I mean, there was a big process, people coming and looking at the property and doing like a canopy study and telling us what we could actually plant on the property. So I don't know, like, I don't know what your experience is or what you've seen with other people, but that hasn't been our experience. Like they've been pretty strict with us when we've had to remove a tree and planting something else. And we have a lot of canopy on our property. So that is like, I just wanted to make a comment about that. And my other one is, you know, I completely also agree with the fines. If there is somebody who's violating the you know, the reasonable use exceptions, if you know, these are critical areas and you know, they're environmentally sensitive. In other areas of the country, there are very steep fines that they place on people for damaging the environment. And I think that we could do that. And if you make those fines high enough, it becomes a deterrent and you just have to follow through with it. And I guess that's my big comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Meredith.
So the good thing about us including H is that kind of the financial security guarantee is like one big fine for 5 years. It makes financial consequences for violating. So at least we're getting that far. And yeah, I think that maybe the other parts of the code need to be addressed to work on fines for after those 5 years have elapsed.
Well, do we need further clarification here in the language again, where when you would tap into the fine, because I think in the prior language that we had from last month, it said if you don't do this within a year, then you have to address it immediately within 2 years. Do we need to further clarify that we tap into this 30% if you don't need it within X amount of time?
Some of the stuff, like, sorry, just for clarity, some of that stuff you're gonna mitigate for a problem or something. Like, it's recommended that you only do it in certain parts of the year, like for installation, some of this plant materials. So, like, to put a time limit, we have sensitive about like how we do that, just because it might not make any sense to like plant this stuff in the dead of summer where if there's no irrigation, it's just dying.
I think we have a lot left to discuss on this, just in terms of, you know, answering some of the questions that we brought up tonight, but also I'd ask each of you to, you know, think about our conversation, think about things that seem solid, maybe anything that seems missing still or is nagging on you. And let's try to get all of that out on the table at our next meeting. Maybe we'll have some answers to some other things we discussed tonight. And then I think we're probably just a few meetings away from being able to make some recommendations to the council on this. It's my sense. But let's use next time just to kind of, there's something we didn't get to tonight. Let's make sure we get to it next time and then just start working on refining the language and wrapping it up. That sound good? Sound good to you, Walter, Melissa, seem reasonable? Excellent. Okay, well, we have 8 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure to leave time for the rest of our agenda. Any new business, Nick?
No.
And then you gave your report on the signs. And then let's see, what about citizens' comments? Do we have anybody joining us this evening that would like to make a comment? Just raise your hand if you do. Yeah. Teacher wait minutes. Okay, well, seeing none, we'll close citizen comments, and I think our agenda for the next meeting, unless something comes up, will be to dive straight into RUVs. If you can come prepared to talk about those items, I'd still like to maybe Nick know a little bit more about processes, postings, and recordings, and so forth. I'll send you some any questions that we can see that.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Any other comments before we wrap up for this evening?
I
Yes.
do have a comment.
Yes,
We
yes,
talked
yes.
a bit about this in our conversation this evening. Just a proposal, like your thoughts on this as a condition. It seems to me that there's a need to provide information to the community in terms of defining a lot of the questions that we have here. Our community has the same kinds of questions. So I am suggesting that I can take a stab at proposing a committee of 1 or 2 or 3 of us to explore what kind of information could be helpful to the community in regards to this process that we're talking about. So that's just real quickly. That's what I'm thinking, because I think it helps the city address the communication, the need to communicate in a way with our neighbors, so that they understand when they go to, for instance, when they go to to a hearing, that the information that they're providing is actually it's based on education, it's based on actual facts that helps the case, helps build a really good relationship between the city and our neighbors. So that's what I'm asking. Would you all be interested in it for me taking a stab, bringing a proposal to our next meeting about some communications that we can provide to the community? That would require a committee to work on.
Yeah, we're not allowed to be more than, I think, 2 people.
Okay.
Or maybe 3 working, otherwise it's considered official city business. But one of the things I like about this proposal is that it does acknowledge and make good on this value we have as a community of communication. But I think it's also can be community building. When I was campaigning last summer, probably 30% of the topic, of all the things that people talked about, there were like 3 that got talked about the most, and our the way building and tree removal happened in our community was number 1. So it does feel useful to sort of provide an education piece like that to the community so that they understand what's happening. Because I do think some people think, oh, I got all this hassle for taking trees down, and this other person just took them down and it seems like no big deal. And so I think something like that is can be also helpful in bringing the community along to understand the code without asking them to read the code.
Right.
So I like that. Yeah, thanks, David.
So do we, at this point, what do you think?
I'm interested.
Yeah.
Okay.
Love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, and really it's about, perhaps we could put this on the agenda for 10 minutes to brainstorm,
Okay.
like what other ideas should we place on there?
Maybe you could start us with an outline of what might be included in something like this. Okay, great. Sounds good. I'm sorry I meant to ask you about that.
But thank you.
Okay, well, it's 8:57. We can talk for 3 minutes, or I can take a motion. No, we got a movement to adjourn, a second. Do we have a second? Very good, thank you. Very good, well done. All right, all those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Seeing none, we are adjourned. It was very nice to see all of you, and thank you for the stimulating conversation, and I'll look forward to more next month. So long.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope your family feels better, Melissa.
Oh, they're fine. They're good. It was just a positive test. That's all. So
Oh, I see.
thank you.